Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and you can find all our archived shows at our website, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org, and you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. Welcome to spring. Happy Easter, everyone. I hope you are enjoying the springtime. Last year around this time, I really wanted to do an episode on rabbits for Easter, but it just didn't come together. But finally, today, we are going to do just that. We have author Mark Hawthorne joining us, and his latest book is called The Way of the Rabbit. So we're going to be discussing rabbits, celebrating rabbits. But before we get into that, I do have just some announcements, and I want to highlight some news that came out recently. So first, I have been hinting to this for quite a while now that I have an edited volume, an anthology that I've edited coming out in late April. And it is finally April. It's called The Humane Hoax: Essays Exposing the Myth of Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs. This has been a project that has been in the works for years. I started this project before the pandemic, so I am thrilled that it's finally coming out. This book is finally coming out. There's essays by 18 authors. They're academics and animal activists and animal rescuers. We have chapters by Carol Adams, Robert Grillo, Silesh Rao, Karen Davis, Christopher Soule Eubanks, Alistair Van Cleek, and many, many more. It covers the topic of humane washing, of course, as well as greenwashing and the environmental connection, language and labels and marketing in alternative, so-called alternative animal agriculture. And we're going to have an online book launch party on April 29th, Saturday, April 29th. And that's going to be at the Climate Healers Conference. It's called VCOP. Climate Healers is Silesh Rao's organization, and Silesh is one of the contributing authors. So we're going to have our book launch party at his conference, the Climate Healers Conference called VCOP. And I'll put a link to that book launch in the show notes. Several of the authors from the book will be joining us at that event. And of course, this book is part of a larger project, the Humane Hoax Project, that is co-sponsored by Compassionate Living and the Micro Sanctuary Movement and Triangle Chicken Advocates. So with that, we also have coming up our 4th annual Humane Hoax Online Conference. And that will be on Saturday, May 20th. And we will also be featuring a few of the authors from the new anthology, just a few of the authors that will be giving larger, more in-depth talks about their chapters and about the humane hoax. That will be on Saturday, May 20th. You can get all of this information at our new website, humanehoax.org. We just did a revamp of that website. It's the same URL, but we updated the website, humanehoax.org. So you should go and check that out. You can get information about the book, about these upcoming events, and I hope that you can join us at one or more of the events around my book coming out. And I'll also be featuring the book on this podcast, of course. We will have some of the authors as guests coming up in the next few episodes, and we'll be discussing more deeply all the aspects of this book, why I compiled and edited this book. So there'll be a lot more to come about my book in the next few episodes. All right, so shifting to a different focus, another thing I wanted to discuss is some news that came out recently that just did not get the mainstream attention that I thought that it should. So I wanted to mention it here, and that is the most recent IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change. About every 7 or so years, they do this really comprehensive kind of deep dive assessment on the climate change crisis. And this one was called Climate Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. This report was created by 270 experts and scientists across 67 countries. And what's really striking and scary about this one, I mean, they've all been very scary, but this one in particular is kind of poignant, really, because it is the last report of its kind from the IPCC before we reach that, dire prediction point, that 1.5 degree increase in temperature that is being called, the tipping point, that point of disaster that's estimated to happen in 2030. And we are headed there full force. It would take a drastic, dramatic, massive reduction in emissions to change that trajectory at this point, which is very unlikely. So we will be reaching that milestone of the 1.5 degree increase before the next report is out. And I can't believe that this isn't headline news, that this is not what every congressional hearing is about and every talk show host is featuring. And it's just, it amazes me. It seems to still be so abstract, even now, even after so much extreme weather and dire warnings. We're just still so oblivious, and it's so frustrating. But I know that you care and I care. So we have to just keep talking about it. We have to keep heeding these warnings, sharing the information, and trying to get others to care as well. The report also cited India as exceptionally vulnerable to climate and the climate crisis, and that India will experience heat and humidity that is unlivable in some areas, water and food scarcity, and extreme weather events that are unimaginable. This breaks my heart because India is a very special place to me and Kojin, being the birthplace of the Dharma traditions, the concept of ahimsa, Sanskrit for nonviolence. And even though it feels so abstract, the climate crisis is violence. It's violence against vulnerable populations that will be so much more affected by the climate disruptions, like India. It's violence towards the animals in that country as well, and other places where the animals will have to face extreme weather conditions, lack of water, lack of food. So if you're vegan, thank you. Thank you for that. It helps immensely. You are reducing your climate impact considerably. If you're not, please live vegan, help mitigate your impact, and do whatever else you can as well. All of us need to, everyone. It's really hopeful to see the transportation sector going electric, but it's just so slow moving. We need to pick up the pace. And really, we need to demand that our representatives make this a top priority, that everyone, media, everyone makes this a top priority, because, I mean, the worse it gets, the more strain there will be on everything, on everyone. We have to have a livable planet. I mean, it's it's laughable that I have to even say that, right? That this isn't everyone's top priority. Well, I'm glad that you care, that there are those out there who get it. I appreciate you. So maybe you can think about what more you can do. I'll have a link to that IPCC report in the show notes. Maybe you can share that with others today. All right, enough of this doom and gloom. Let's think about rabbits. Let's think about who we are saving this planet for. Those adorable, fluffy, hoppy, nose-wiggling little cuties. I feel better. All right, let's get into today's conversation. Okay, I am really excited for our interview today because today we are going to be talking about rabbits. Today we have author Mark Hawthorne, and he is the author of numerous books on animal rights and social justice, including A Vegan Ethic, Embracing a Life of Compassion Towards All, and the bestselling Striking at the Roots, A Practical Guide to Animal Activism. But his most recent book, the one we're going to be talking about today, is called The Way of the Rabbit, which he describes as, quote, an affectionate history of nature's most surprising species. Mark's a longtime rabbit lover who's fostered and rescued a lot of bunnies over the years, 8 of whom he has adopted. Maybe we'll hear a little about them. He also volunteers with the vegan food justice group Food Empowerment Project that was founded by his partner, Lauren Ornelas. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks so much, Hope. I really appreciate you having me on your podcast.
So glad you could come on, and so glad that we could do this around spring and Easter and talk about rabbits. I'm really excited. I love rabbits, love to think about them and see them. They are just one of the most adorable and darling of the animal kingdom. So let's start, though, with a little about you. We like to start by asking when you went vegan, why you went vegan. Tell us your vegan origin story.
The short answer is I went vegan for the animals in 2001. But the longer version is that, like most people, I grew up eating animals, and yet I considered myself to be a compassionate person.
Yeah.
And let's see, I guess it was the early 90s, I was privileged to travel the world, and I went to Pamplona, Spain to participate in the running of the bulls. And the bulls, they
like, as you mean, just like you wanted to see it, or as a participant, or
I wanted to participate.
Really?
Yeah, I thought it was very exciting. I was an English major. I read Hemingway, so I read The Sun Also Rises, which focuses a lot on bullfighting, unfortunately. And again, I had this this duality, this thought in my mind that I was a compassionate person, yet I still participated in animal exploitation. And it took me a while to get around that. But yeah, so I ran with the bulls, and then the bulls run into a bull ring, and they're led into the back area. But the organizers bring out these smaller bulls, which the fiesta participants taunt and harass. And I sat up in the stands watching this, and I just felt really ashamed for being a part of it. Hope, I wish I could say that I went vegan or even vegetarian that day, but at least a seed was planted. And a few months later, I was fortunate to live in Ladakh, which is in the Himalayas of India. And I lived with a Buddhist family, and almost everything I ate came from their garden. After about a month, I realized how good I felt. I was essentially vegan. And I felt not just physically good, but mentally and even spiritually. And the family that I lived with didn't have a refrigerator. So when winter approached, they dug a large hole in the garden, and they harvested the crops, and they buried them. And then they let this beautiful cow onto the property. And I stood there right near her as she nibbled on the remaining stalks and stems. As I watched her, it occurred to me that she had as much desire, as much right to live as I did. So that was the day I stopped eating cows. I had been gone from the US at that point for 2 years. So I returned, and I gradually stopped eating meat from all animals. But I was one of those people who felt they just couldn't give up eggs and dairy. And one reason was I loved to bake, and I didn't know about egg replacements at that time. So I began reading Diet for a New America by John Robbins, and started feeling really bad about my consumption of cheese and eggs. I even contacted Karen Davis at United Poultry Concerns and asked her if there wasn't some way I could possibly consume eggs ethically. And she assured me that there was absolutely no way to do that.
Yeah.
And then I visited a sanctuary for farmed animals and got to meet some of the cows and chickens rescued from the dairy and egg industries. And after learning their stories, I knew I didn't want to be supporting those industries. So I went vegan that day.
You have a very international story, learning from other cultures, both in negative and positive ways, right?
Yeah. And when I talk about travel, I like to say that I was privileged to do that, because I not only feel privileged to have experienced these cultures, but privileged to have been able to afford, financially, and as a white male, in some sense, to physically to do these things that a lot of other people aren't able to do. So I always honor that. I try to honor it by saying it was a privilege.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you learned what you did and experienced what you did, and became the amazing activist that you are today, and utilizing your talent as a writer to write some really compelling and amazing books for the movement. So your latest book, that's what we want to talk about today. It's called The Way of the Rabbit. And of course, it's springtime, it's around Easter time. So we start thinking about rabbits and bunnies. We see images of them, on decorations and cards, and they are this symbol of spring and renewal. So, why did you write The Way of the Rabbit? What inspired you to write it?
I wrote The Way of the Rabbit because I really love and admire rabbits. I love how gentle they are and that they're herbivores. I didn't have a rabbit companion when I was a kid, but after I went vegan, I decided I wanted to be more involved in the animal advocacy community. So I started doing volunteer work that involved rabbits. One of the things I did was to foster rabbits for a local Bay Area nonprofit called Save a Bunny, and I ended up adopting every rabbit I fostered. Uh,
Foster
plus
fails.
yeah, plus a couple more on top of that. And so the book was really inspired by them. And another reason I wrote The Way of the Rabbit is that there really aren't enough nonfiction books about rabbits. You go into any bookstore, and if you find a nonfiction book about rabbits, it will most likely be one that explains how to breed them or goes into very painful detail about how rabbits are exploited. And although I think it's important that we have books that show how humans abuse rabbits, I wanted to create a fun book that celebrates their history and their personalities. So that's why I wrote it.
Oh, wonderful. So in the book, you have some history of the rabbit in like folklore and literature, and evidence that rabbits have been companions to humans for a very, very long time. Can you share some of what you learned researching your book?
Yes, rabbits feature in so many cultures. A number of cultures associate rabbits with feminine principles and the moon. And one of my favorite stories concerns the jade rabbit, who is a character from Chinese folklore. The jade rabbit was sent to the moon by a figure known as the Jade Emperor, who was the highest ruler of heaven and the gods. He disguised himself as a poor elderly man and went out to beg for food from the animals on Earth. Now, all the animals found food that was appropriate for the human, but the rabbit was only experienced in gathering grass. So he threw himself on a fire to offer his own body as nourishment. And the Jade Emperor was so impressed by the rabbit's self sacrifice that as a reward, he sent him to the moon to live forever as the Jade Rabbit. In fact, while many Western cultures see a so called man in the moon, many cultures in Asia see a rabbit in the moon.
Huh.
Yeah. And let's see, as for literature,
Yeah, can I
rabbits.
just I just want to make just a comment on that though.
Yeah.
Stories like that are so frustrating to me because it feels like us justifying meat eating, like trying. I think and I think it's that we have had this conflict within us for a millennia about eating animals. And so we create these stories that are in some way trying to make us feel better about that conflict and that discontent around eating animals. And it's interesting, that's yet another one where it's kind of like, there's this guilt, right?
Right. Right. So you're talking about the rabbit's self-sacrifice and that he was
Yeah,
gonna.
yeah, that
Yeah.
it's like he self-sacrificed himself, and it's like, well, no, we're the ones killing them.
Right.
So
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. I agree. Yeah.
yeah.
Let's see. And then you asked about literature. Well, let's see. Rabbits are among the most popular characters. Just for example, we have the Velveteen Rabbit, the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland, the
Peter
rabbits of
Rabbit.
Peter Rabbit. Yep.
Yep.
Watership Down, Rabbit
Oh
from Winnie the
yeah,
Pooh.
Watership Down. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Tearjerker.
definitely.
And although most of these are intended for children, there are a number of adult themes as well. I think we should remember, for instance, the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland might seem like he's just always in a hurry, but he can also be viewed as a symbol of Alice's quest for knowledge because he inspires her spiritual awakening.
Yeah.
And he acts as a liaison between life on the surface and the world underground. And this symbolism has carried over into popular culture with movies like The Matrix, where Neo is prompted to, quote unquote, follow the white rabbit to learn about the truth of his existence. Yeah, as for companion animals, yes, humans have had rabbits as companions for thousands of years. People in ancient China may have domesticated wild rabbits to be companions, and there's evidence of at least one pet rabbit in England from the first century of the Common Era. But having rabbits as companions really became popular in the 19th century when it was thought that having boys and girls care for rabbits would teach them lessons in responsibility. Now, of course, rabbits are so popular that they are the victims of widespread breeding. And to help counter that, we have countless rabbit rescue organizations and educational groups like the House Rabbit Society.
Yeah, well, I learned firsthand how difficult it is to find homes for unwanted rabbits. Kojin and I, my husband and I, came across three rabbits in a park that were obviously domestic rabbits that had obviously been dumped there the night before. They were wet and shivering. And so we took them home and, had three rabbits in our bathtub for many hours, something like 16 hours trying to find a place to bring them. And it was very difficult, even though this was when we were in the Bay Area and there were numerous specific rabbit rescues. And boy, we could not, it was very difficult. Everybody was just at capacity and wanted to help and were very, helpful in some ways, but just as far as placing them, getting them someplace safe, it was very, very difficult. So it's definitely an issue. But I'll also say that rabbits are such a wonderful companion, especially for vegans, because they are vegan themselves,
Yep,
right?
absolutely. You can shop together practically. A lot of times,
You
uh,
can what?
you can shop together, right? For the
Oh,
same
shop
food,
together. Yes.
yeah, for some of the same veggies. A lot of
Yeah.
times, my wife Lauren and I will be at a co-op or something buying dandelion greens and kale and cilantro and parsley and
Mm,
such, and the
yeah.
checker will say, "Wow, you eat healthy," and we'll say, "No, this is actually for our rabbit." So
That's great. Yeah, so but it is an issue, right? That there's just so many and it's difficult to find homes for them all.
it is, yeah, it is very difficult to find homes for them. And I think I remember your story. I think you posted on social media some
Yeah,
some beautiful photos of them and your efforts to try to find homes for them. So thank you for that.
of course. Of course. Yeah. And I think that, rabbits aren't thought of as companion animals as much, of course, as dogs or cats. And if you're thinking about bringing an animal into your home, they're not really thought of, and they're just wonderful companions. Tell us about your rabbits.
Well, we have one bunny right now. His name is Benito. He was named after Benito Juarez, who was the first indigenous president of Mexico.
Wow.
And we found him a couple of years ago. He was abandoned on a street, and this was a couple months after Easter. And my thinking is that he was bought as an Easter present. And after the novelty wore off, the parents decided that he can go free. So many of these rabbits end up in shelters or just dumped on a street corner,
Yeah.
or in the woods or in a park, because the human who does that thinks that they can survive, that they're a wild animal, and they're not. They're domesticated. Those instincts have been bred out of them,
Yeah.
many of the instincts, and they will not survive. So we picked them up and brought them home and had the same challenges that you and Kojin did in trying to find somebody who would take him. And we just ended up falling in love with him ourselves. So we ended up keeping him.
That's great. Yeah, we really considered keeping those bunnies, but we had a very small place and we were planning to move soon. There were just numerous factors that we weren't able to keep them. But yeah.
Yeah, they're not. Hope they're. I'm not saying that adopting a rabbit is for everyone, because you really need to educate yourself about them before you even think about having a rabbit. And you might have a dog, or you might have a cat, or you might have a very small child in the house, or there's many reasons why a rabbit might not be right for you.
Yeah.
But what you went through in trying to find a responsible rescue. I mean, that's exactly what I would hope for a bunny who's found abandoned.
Yeah, and you mentioned that he had been abandoned right after Easter, and that is such a, heartbreaking thing that does happen around Easter because of course we're thinking about rabbits and they are such the symbol of this time of year. So people will buy them just kind of like you said on a whim as a novelty, and then realize that it is a lot of responsibility or for whatever reason. But what is the connection with rabbits and Easter? Because you explore that in the book, right?
Right, I do. And as you mentioned, they have a long connection. They've long been a symbol of spring and rebirth. And as you mentioned, they're both associated with Easter, but it's probably the Easter bunny that most people are familiar with. And there are a number of theories as to how a rabbit became connected to Easter. Perhaps the most popular one concerns the spring goddess Yoster, who may have had a cult following in ancient Britain and whose sacred animal was supposedly a rabbit or a hare. As best that historians can tell, the Easter Bunny originated in northern Germany, probably sometime in the 16th or 17th century. But he started out as an Easter fox, possibly inspired by the fox's habit of stealing and burying eggs, and then became an Easter hare before finally becoming the Easter Bunny. And then he migrated to the British Isles in the 19th century and was very popular in the Victorian era. This is when we see a boom in greeting cards from lots of holidays like Christmas and Easter greeting cards. Some are very strange with like insects and frogs, fishing and things like this. But many of these cards featured rabbits. And we don't know exactly how the Easter Bunny made his way to the United States, but it's possible that the tradition came over with the German immigrants who settled in Pennsylvania in the 18th century and brought with them tales of the Easter hare, and they would celebrate with cakes and other sweets, and they would give eggs to well-behaved children.
Fascinating. Well, now it's so pervasive. You just see really rabbits all over the place at Easter, and I hope that translates into more compassion for them, and less exploitation. One can hope.
Yeah, one can hope. That's true.
So, what else in your book? Tell us something else interesting that you discovered.
Well, one of the most interesting things, I think, is that for the longest time, the theory was that rabbits were first domesticated by these monks in France, and that they were being raised as food, and that eventually they became companion animals to people. When in actual fact, we now know that rabbits are, as companions, they go back a lot longer, and they were actually brought to the British Isles in the first century of the Common Era. So there's this long fallacy that rabbits are a fairly new companion animal or a fairly new phenomenon as a companion animal, when in fact it's thousands of years old. So that was something that was really interesting to me. Oh, Hope, there's another great story I can tell you. I especially love the story of Spot, a rabbit in England. England imports most of its cut flowers from the Netherlands, and in 2003, a little wild rabbit got inside a shipment of chrysanthemums and was being sent across the North Sea by boat from Holland to Cromer, this little town, which is about 140 miles north of London. And the flowers ended up at the shop of a woman named Helen Paris, who was very surprised to find this cute little rabbit in the box.
Huh.
She contacted the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and then she soon got a call from Britain's agricultural authorities who told her that the rabbit would need to be euthanized unless she would be willing to fund the cost of having her put into quarantine for 6 months, which was a lot of money at the time. I think it was the equivalent of about $1,000.
Mm.
And Helen didn't have the money, but she was determined to help this rabbit, whom she had named Spot. So she created a campaign called Save Our Spot, SOS. And she was well connected with other local businesses. So pretty soon there were these Save Our Spot donation boxes all over town.
Mm.
And the story made national news. So
Wow.
there were donations coming in through the mail. In the meantime, while the money was coming in, Helen began researching the best homes to place Spot. And she ended up contacting more than 40 or so sanctuaries, and then finally called Wendy Valentine at Hillside Animal Sanctuary, which had a colony of rescued rabbits. And Helen told me one reason that she picked Hillside is that Wendy is such a strong advocate for animals. Spot was finally released from animal control, and the news media followed her to Hillside, where she lived happily and passed away in 2010. Now, Hope, I love this story because it demonstrates how much people can care about animals. And I'm not just talking about Helen, I'm talking about the many people who contributed money from all over England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland to help Spot, an animal that they would never meet. So,
Very sweet. So rabbits, like, of course, basically all domesticated animals, or many domesticated animals, are exploited in so many ways. Rabbits are tested on in labs and killed for their fur. And of course, your book doesn't go into all this. Your book has a different focus. But I just wanted to ask you about how there's so many people now that are raising rabbits for meat in their backyards, like backyard butchers, do it yourself kind of butcher enthusiasts. I mean, rabbit meat has been eaten for a very long time. But of course, it's not in the US, it's not sold in stores. It's not a regular meat or a popular meat. We don't see it in stores, we don't see it in restaurants. However, it's starting to become more popular as a backyard kind of situation for backyard butchers. And this is related to the humane hoax, thinking that it's more humane to kill the animals yourself. Can you talk about this a bit?
yeah, absolutely. I want to preface this by saying that I do not cover this in my book. This is a topic, obviously, that's very sad, and my book is about celebrating animals. However, I do know that there are a number of reasons that rabbits are popular among so-called backyard butchers. First is that they are considered an inexpensive investment, and rabbits they reproduce very quickly. The gestation period is just 30 days, and the female will give birth to between 4 and 12 kits, and that's what the baby rabbits are called. And she can get pregnant again almost immediately afterward. This is one reason that people who have a companion rabbit really need to have them spayed and neutered. And it is thought that rabbits raised for meat don't need a lot of space, so backyard butchers will cram them into cages like the egg industry crams hens together. Rabbits are also easy to handle, and they tend to be very quiet, docile animals, and they don't really smell. So all these reasons make them attractive, unfortunately, to those who want to exploit them for their flesh.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's interesting that is becoming more and more popular. So something we need to be aware of. Well, Mark, you've also written numerous other books. And just to maybe kind of veer off the rabbits for a moment, I'd love to ask you about one of your books, which happens to be my favorite one, and that is Bleating Hearts, The Hidden World of Animal Suffering. And this one, it's bleating hearts, not bleeding hearts, bleating like a lamb makes the sound of bleating. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, Bleeding Hearts came about after my first book, which was Striking at the Roots, was published. I had been hearing from activists from around the world telling me how they were using tactics from Striking at the Roots to campaign for animals. And many of the forms of exploitation they were campaigning against were not very familiar to me at the time. For example, like animals used in ritual sacrifice, or animals used in art projects, conceptual art. So I wrote Bleating Hearts to shine a light on these lesser known forms of exploitation and also help readers understand the suffering of animals in the forms of exploitation that are more well known, such as food and fashion and research and sports.
Yeah, you really get into some areas that are not as well known. Really, I think important and interesting aspects of animal exploitation that we should know about. So it's a really great book.
Yeah, thank you for asking about it, Hope. It's a book that is well read, but I've heard from a lot of people who tell me that they simply can't read it. It's just too sad. But I tell them if you get to a chapter or a section that you just can't handle, skip to the next one. Every chapter ends with something that you can do to make a difference in
Mm.
these forms of exploitation. It's not, it's meant to empower activists. It's meant to empower consumers and readers. It's not meant to make you feel hopeless.
Yeah.
So, if you can handle a documentary about animal exploitation, you can certainly handle Bleeding Hearts.
Yeah, I mean, just take it in as small, perhaps small bites, just as much as you can handle. But it is, of course, so important for us to know what's going on, know what's happening to these animals, so that we can take action and we can help. So,
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yes, thank you.
yeah. Well, bringing it back to rabbits, what is it that, speaking of things we can do or positive actions we can take, what can people do to help protect rabbits?
Oh, thank you for asking that, Hope. Rabbits face a lot of threats, in addition to animal agriculture and animal testing and the other forms of exploitation we've already discussed. Rabbit populations suffer from climate change, from deforestation, from urban development. One of the best and easiest things we can do is to simply treat rabbits with kindness. That
Mm.
includes not participating in rabbit exploitation. So don't wear their fur, don't eat them, don't use products tested on animals. If you're thinking about getting a rabbit as a companion, please do some research about them. Many parents, as we've discussed, will give kids a rabbit as an Easter present, not realizing the care they require. And sadly, as we've also discussed, many people dump rabbits at a shelter or abandon them in parks. To help rabbits in nature, you can look for humane solutions to keep them from eating from your garden. For example, you can plant onions since rabbits dislike the smell. You can also landscape with plants that rabbits don't particularly care for, such as bee balm or catmint or ice plant or juniper. And don't forget the importance of strong fencing. You can also watch out for nests. Not all rabbits burrow safely underground. So before mowing your lawn, please check the grass carefully and look for patches of dead grass, which may cover a nest near the ground surface. So baby rabbits grow up fast, and the family will likely be gone within a few weeks. You can also volunteer at a wildlife rehabilitation center or support wildlife rescue nonprofits. And finally, don't disturb baby rabbits you think are orphans. Mother rabbits know that they have a scent that a predator can pick up, so they often leave their babies alone for long periods of time, and they will return to nurse them. If you really believe a wild rabbit has been abandoned, then please contact a wildlife rescue group. So those are just a few of the things. I have a long list at the end of the book about things people can do.
Yeah. Yeah. And also supporting domestic rabbit rescues with, donations of bedding and that kind of thing,
Yes.
or just financial donations. Yeah.
Yeah, most communities have a rabbit rescue, whether it's a chapter of the House Rabbit Society or just some other local rabbit rescue or wildlife rescue. And a lot of these groups, they need volunteers, they need cash donations. They even have wish lists posted online, like Amazon wish lists of things that the rescue needs, and all that helps.
Yeah. Yeah. And even stuffed animals. If you have stuffed animals that you want to pass on, the bunnies like to kind of play with and hug on the stuffed animals, right?
They do, and in fact, even sharing on social media the work that these groups are doing will be beneficial. Will help spread the word.
Right. Yeah. Good idea. All good ideas. Wow. Thank you so much, Mark. And, thank you for writing this book. I think it's just such a wonderful thing to celebrate rabbits. I'm very, very happy that you wrote this book. So we're going to need to wrap up, and I would love to ask you our last question, which is, what gives you hope for the future?
Oh, what gives me hope for the future? I think what gives me hope, and I really do have a lot of hope, is a combination of all the remarkable activists who work so hard, along with how the vegan movement has grown. I'm thinking of some trips that Lauren and I have been privileged to take to Europe over the last decade. We went back to England and Scotland recently, and we were amazed by how many vegan restaurants and vegan options there were compared to just 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Nice.
Even a pub in a small town in the Scottish Highlands offered a vegan pasta dish, and it was delicious.
Wow.
So yeah, these are the things that help me feel good about life and feel good about the movement.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today. Thank you for all your amazing writings and for writing The Way of the Rabbit. I'm just thrilled that we're able to celebrate rabbits today.
Oh, thank you, Hope. I had so much fun writing that book, and I hope people have as much fun reading it. And thank you for having me on your podcast. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. Well, that was fun to think about rabbits for a little while. I love that rabbits are a vegan option for a companion animal. There's all this controversy over whether or not to feed dogs or cats vegan. Well, no controversy with rabbits. They are 100% vegan. If you liked this episode, please share it with a friend, perhaps a friend who likes bunnies. Enjoy the spring, happy Easter, and live vegan.